Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajmain. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brothers and sisters, as many of you know, February is recognized by some as Black History Month. And in light of this, the Executive Committee of the Islamic Society of Central Virginia has asked me in this month to use the weekly program to highlight the lives, the religious, scholastic, historic, and other contributions of Black Muslims. Their word, not mine. I personally prefer Muslims of color, Muslims of African descent, African Muslims, or Muslims of African descent, something like that. That's my personal preference. However, it is their belief, and by their I mean the board, that speaking to the Black Muslim experience, again, their word, not mine, and highlighting these individuals of color for the community in Charlottesville and beyond during this month will truly enrich our own experience as Muslims, but will also help educate us on the diverse contributions and experiences that make up the tapestry of Muslim history. So that's the goal, that's the objective. And so what we will be doing today, inshallah ta'ala, what we're going to present today will serve as a introduction of sorts. And what we'll be talking about is Black History Month as a concept, the premise behind it, the Islamic perspective on that concept, the Islamic perspective on racial prejudice and inequality, and also the current Muslim reality. That's what we'll be talking about today, inshallah ta'ala, and then tomorrow or beyond, we'll begin to look at some of the actual stories and the lives and the heroes and heroines who were and are colored, of African descent, etc., who made major contributions to Islam. So Black History Month. It's basically, as you know, you may know, it's a month designated to promote, recognize, and celebrate the historical contributions of Africans and African Americans. And the reason why it was established is that its originator, Carter G. Woodson, he witnessed the gross mistreatment of people of color in American society. He witnessed how they were denied basic human rights, were represented and portrayed, and how history books in this country particularly spoke of them only as slaves or former slaves and did not mention any of their achievements and or contributions, despite them being quite numerous. And he recognized how this impacted how people of color saw themselves and how other people saw them. He felt that if educators were to showcase the humanity of African Americans, their intelligence, their resilience, their creativity, their dignity, that if they showed and showcased all these things, how this would inspire Black people, African American people, people of color to think highly of themselves, and also to change the way that other races, particularly white Americans, saw them. And he thought that through this Black History Month, he could make white America see that people of color in this country have played important roles in making America and therefore deserve to be treated equally under the law, treated as equal citizens. And he really hoped to prove the worth of the people of color. And he thought that once a person of color's worth was established, his equality could no longer be denied. Now, obviously, Carter G. Woodson's objective, his aim, his goal, it was very noble. But this goal, this objective that he set out to achieve was not at that time and has not, up to the present day, still has not been achieved. And despite changes in policy, systemic racism remains a reality in this country. And we just saw a summer of protests in this country and actually throughout the world, protesting racial inequality, systemic racism, racism in general, and racism in policing in particular. And so that's the clearest indication that anyone can provide that we've still got a long way to go. We can also look at schools and housing, neighborhoods. They remain in this country highly segregated, highly segregated. And people of color continue to face discrimination in everything you can imagine. Education, economics, employment, healthcare, political representation, policing, incarceration, and the list goes on and on and on. And what that teaches us is that changing policy changes nothing if people do not change. We can change the policies, we can write laws, we can institute new rules and regulations and bills like the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Act, etc. We can do this all day long if people are inherently racist and they refuse to change the way that they think and the way that they view others who do not look like them. Then the result will remain the same. They'll just find a way to circumvent these laws and rules as they have, and will continue to espouse racism and to practice racism and discrimination, etc. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about this clearly in the Quran, or He mentions this clearly in the Quran when He says, "Inna Allah la yughayyiru ma biqawmin hatta yughayyiru ma bi anfusihim." He says, indeed, Allah does not change the condition of a people until they themselves change what is within themselves. That we can change the laws, we can change policy, but policy changes nothing if people themselves don't willingly commit to change. People will just what? They'll run roughshod over the rules, they'll ignore the rules, they'll violate the rules and regulations and continue to practice the discriminatory practices that they believe are right, or that they hold. But the next point I wanted to mention was we've talked about what the concept of Black History Month is, what is the premise behind it. Now let's look at the Islamic perspective on Black History Month. So our religion, brothers and sisters, is against doing right by people, or treating them as they ought to be treated, or recognizing them as they ought to be recognized for a limited period of time. If people deserve to be respected, if people deserve to be valued, if people deserve to be recognized, then Islam says we shouldn't recognize them for a limited period of time. For example, 1 day, 1 week, 1 month out of the year. But rather we should do so consistently. As the Prophet ﷺ, he said in the one hadith, he said, خير الأعمال وأحبها إلى الله أدومها وإن قل. He said, the best and most beloved deeds to Allah are those which are done consistently, even if they are few. And this is why, brothers and sisters, we don't have in Islam, we don't have something called Mother's Day, where you honor your mother 1 day out of the year, or Father's Day, where you honor your father 1 day out of the year, or Valentine's Day, where you honor your spouse 1 day out of the year. Rather, we are supposed to honor these people who deserve to be honored. We're supposed to honor them consistently, which is why the Prophet told the man who asked him, he said, Man ahaqqud nasi bihusni sahabati. He said, Ya Rasulullah, who is the person who has the most right to my good companionship, to be treated well and to be honored and respected? And the Prophet said, Ummuk thumma ummuk thumma ummuk. He said, your mother, your mother, your mother, thumma abuk, and then your father. Telling the man that that your mother has this place, this status that she occupies, and she should be honored not once, not twice, but 3 times more than what? Than your father. And obviously you can't honor your mother to the extent that the Prophet has mentioned this hadith by honoring her once a year. And so the point I'm trying to make is that the concept itself is really un-Islamic. That we shouldn't be people who are, for lack of a better word, prejudiced. We engage in discriminatory practices. We mistreat people of color throughout the year, and then February comes and then we honor them. We admit that they made very consequential contributions to history, to scholarship, and to technology, etc. We shouldn't be that type of people. But, however, our religion is a religion which encourages the believers to remind one another, to engage in this mutual reminding, and to give advice and to remind each other about those blind spots that we have in our deen. So for example, the Prophet ﷺ said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, فَذَكِّرْ فَإِنَّ الذِّكْرَ تَنْفَعُ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. He says, so remind, because reminder benefits the believers. And the Prophet said in the hadith, he said, ad-deen an-nasiha. And he said it 3 times. He said, religion is being sincere and advising sincerely. What does that mean? That basically means that the reality of us as human beings is that we forget. That there are aspects of our religion that we learn and then we forget about them. We stop being observant of them. And there are some that we're aware of, but because of our own issues, let's call them, we just refuse to practice them. So we may not be aware of what our religion says about discrimination and prejudice and basically othering people. And we may be aware of it, but we just don't adhere to the teachings as it relates to these issues. And so either way, our religion wants us what? To remind, and to seize every opportunity to remind. And so if Black History Month is a month that allows us or gives us a platform, an opportunity to remind ourselves about these issues and about where we're supposed to stand regarding these issues, then we can seize that opportunity. But we have to understand that this is not the way it should be. We shouldn't be the people who only think about the value of Muslims of color, African Muslims, African American Muslims, Muslims of color and their contributions. We only value that and care about that and mention that and talk about that and recognize that 1 month out of the year. That should not be the way we are. But we can use this as an opportunity to remind ourselves and remind others about how we should be looking at this issue of race and ethnicity and colorism, etc. With that said, what is the Islamic perspective on racial prejudice and racial inequality? So this is a good opportunity for us to remind ourselves about that. So first and foremost, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, He says, يَا أَيُّهَا النَّاسُ إِنَّا خَلَقْنَاكُم مِّن ذَكَرٍ وَأُنثَى وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِندَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O mankind, we have created you from a single male and a single female, and made you nations and tribes to know one another. Indeed, the noblest of you with Allah is the most God-fearing and God-conscious, the most committed of you. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that how we should view this issue of differences. Differences in ethnicity, differences in culture, differences in language, differences in colors, right? How should we view that? We should view it first and foremost, Allah made us like this, لِتَعَارَفُوا, so that we get to know each other. So we would know where we came from, what tribes, what nations we belong to, right? So we can trace our lineage and know who we're related to and give the rights to the people to whom we're related. And also, He wants us to realize that these differences do not make one group or one individual superior to another, except by way of what? Piety. We also have the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, he echoes this sentiment. He said, لا فضل لعربي على أعجمي ولا لأعجمي على عربي ولا لأبيض على أسود ولا لأسود على أبيض إلا بالتقوى. He said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, there is no supremacy for an Arab over a non-Arab, or for a non-Arab over an Arab, or for a white over a black, or for a black over a white, except by virtue of piety and religious commitment. Also, when the Prophet ﷺ, when he first conquered Mecca, and he gave a maw'idah, he gave an address to the pagans of Mecca, who by and large had this issue of supremacy, believing that they were superior to everyone else. They also had the issue of colorism, the issue of ethnic prejudice and racial prejudice. They had all of this stuff going on. The Prophet ﷺ gave them an address after conquering Mecca, and he said, "Ya ma'shar Quraysh, inna Allah qad adhhab ankum naqwat al-jahiliyyati wa ta'addumaha bil-aba. An-nasu min Adam wa Adam min turab." He said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, "O people of Quraysh, surely Allah has abolished from you all the pride of the pre-Islamic period of ignorance, and all the pride in your ancestry. All men are descended from Adam, and Adam came from dirt." Also, when the Prophet ﷺ came to know about a Muslim who had insulted another Muslim because of the color of his mother's skin, not the color of his skin, the color of his mother's skin, he insulted him and used that as a way to denigrate him, to humiliate him. When the Prophet came to know about this, he said to that man who insulted that other Muslim using his mother's skin as his weapon of choice, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Innaka umrun fika jahiliyyah." He said, you are a man with ignorance in you. The Prophet called that ignorance. And so these are just a few of the many nusus, the many religious texts that tell us, brothers and sisters, where our religion stands. Underscore that, where our religion stands as it relates to the issue of racial prejudice and racial inequality, colorism, ethnic prejudice, etc. Our religion is totally against it. But unfortunately, the reality is that it's not uncommon for our religion to stand in a place, and for Muslims to stand in a very different place. So what is the Muslim reality? We talked about the Islamic reality, right? The Islamic position. But what is the Muslim reality? The reality of the Muslim community is that although at first glance we appear to be multicultural, highly inclusive, and we seem to be, when people look at us from the outside, we seem to be spared the racial and ethnic divisions that have affected other communities. When people look at us, they come to, for example, a Friday prayer, and they see this cornucopia of ethnicities. They think, oh man, look how racially diverse and ethnically diverse these communities are. Look how multicultural they are. Look how inclusive they are. When you look at that, and they think these people have been spared the divisions upon these lines that we've been afflicted with. That's what you think. But the reality, brothers and sisters, is that we are similarly divided along the lines of wealth, class, education, occupation, nationality, and yes, color, race, and ethnicity. We're divided along these lines, and we, as a community, not talking about specific individuals, but we as a community, a Muslim community, we other each other. And we harbor contempt and disdain for one another based upon these lines that we mentioned. And we treat each other differently based upon these lines. And if we're honest with ourselves, we know it's true. So, for example, it's not common in Muslim communities where you have, these racially and ethnically diverse communities, people from all over the Muslim world, representing so many different languages and cultures and ethnicities, etc., and nationalities. It's not uncommon for them not to mix, to divide themselves into sub-communities, and those sub-communities associate only with themselves. And they're totally separated. You don't, generally speaking, I'm not saying they're not exceptions to the rule, but generally speaking, you don't find people from the Afghan community associated with people from the Arab community. You don't find the Kurds, for example, if you have Kurds in your community, associating with the Arabs. You don't find people from the subcontinent, generally speaking, associating with and hanging out with the Arabs. You just don't see that. They all associate with each other. You can see it in these community dinners. You'll see it. You'll see, for example, generally speaking, I'm not saying they're not exceptions, but generally speaking, you have community dinners, multicultural community, and every table is full of people who are from the same ethnicity. They just gravitate towards each other, and they don't mix with each other. You don't see, for example, in Muslim communities, the rich Muslims hang out with the poor Muslims. The highly educated hanging out with the people who are not educated. Basically their educational credentials are scarce, are scant, are meager at best. You don't see that. You don't see this class of people associating with this class of people. You just don't see it. And so again, this reality shows you that we have this veneer of inclusiveness. We have this veneer of we don't see color, we don't see race. We have that veneer, but the reality is very different than what? Than that veneer. So that being said, we definitely need this reminder. We need to be reminded about where we should stand versus where we are actually standing. Whether or not that reminder will be effective remains to be seen. Because the reality is that these feelings of supremacy that many of us harbor are feelings that we choose to harbor. And oftentimes we refuse to do what? To relinquish them. We intentionally, we know better, but we choose not to do better. It's not that we don't know better. You ask somebody, what does Islam say about race and equality? People are quick. They're quick to tell you, they're quick to quote that ayah that we quoted from Surah Al-Hujurat. Right? Oh, inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. The best of you in the sight of Allah are those who are the most pious, the most God-fearing, the most religiously committed. We're quick to quote that. We know what Islam says. We know where Islam stands. But we choose to stand what? We choose to stand elsewhere. We choose not to relinquish those feelings of what? Of supremacy. No matter how often we are told that feeling this way in our religion is wrong. Which is why the Prophet ﷺ, he actually said, this is the reality, unfortunately. It's not right, but it is our reality. He said, Arba'un. Fi ummati min amr al-jahiliyyati la yatrukunahun. He said, there are 4 things from the pre-Islamic period of ignorance, which the Prophet came, by the way, to eradicate. Everything from the pre-Islamic period of ignorance, the Prophet came to what? To eradicate it. Right? And this is one. These things he's going to mention are among those things. And he mentioned 2 things among those 4. He said, Al-fakhru bil-ahsab wa-ta'nu fil-ansab. He said, boasting about their assumed superior status and attacking the pedigrees of others. Deeming themselves superior and deeming other people inferior. These are 2 things from Amr al-Jahiliyyah, which my ummah, they won't leave. They know better, but they just refuse to do better. So, to conclude, these were the opening and introductory statements that I wanted to make. And I hope that the last statement will encourage us to attend these halaqat, to attend these virtual circles that we're going to have, and these virtual meetings that we're going to have, where we're going to highlight the stories, the lives, the contributions of these heroes and heroines of color. We're going to highlight that. We hope that what we just heard, our reality versus the Islamic reality, will encourage people to attend, so that we can, and we won't just mention their stories, but inshallah ta'ala, we will mention their stories and try to contemplate, reflect upon them, and extrapolate the lessons from their experiences, which will help us to be better Muslims ourselves, and also to build a truly inclusive Muslim community. That hopefully this will wake us up, and we'll do the Prophet proud. Because when the Prophet said that we won't leave these affairs of Jahiliyyah, he wasn't saying it like it's okay. He was saying it that they should leave it, but the nature of people will keep them from leaving it. We want to do the Prophet proud. We want to, in this case, we want to go against what's expected. We want to swim upstream. We want to do the thing which is not commonplace. We want to make the Prophet proud and eradicate this fakhr, this boasting and bragging about who we think we are. And also this ta'an fil ansab, putting down other people for what we consider to be their less than lofty pedigrees. And with that, brothers and sisters, we'll bring today's introduction to a close, and we look forward to meeting with you in the coming days to talk about the lives, the experiences, the contributions of these great heroes and heroines of color of Islam. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.